إن الحمد لله نحمده ونستعينه ونستغفره ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا ومن سيئات أعمالنا من يهده الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلل فلا هادي له وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأن محمدا عبده ورسوله أما بعد. I recently received a copy of Hijab's book The Burhan, in which he claims to provide a definitive Kalami proof for the existence of a maker, in the same manner that Craig and his followers would argue propositionally for theism. He starts the book on the very first passage of the introduction with a statement that we Salafis ought to disagree with fundamentally. He says, according to the most recent data published by Pew Research Center, 90% of Americans believe in higher power. Although many people in the UK and the US no longer believe in a particular religion, only 5% are strident atheists, in a manner which indicates acceptance of the arguments of new atheists. Percentage-wise, this may not seem like much, but 5% is a significant proportion of the overall population. The fact that some people are rejecting faith in God would suggest that either they are unconvinced with the evidence for God's existence, or that arguments for God's existence have been demolished. Okay. Now, what's really striking about this conclusion he builds so casually upon the aforementioned statistic is that it exhibits categorical failure in recognizing or even considering the actual reason why there exist people who choose to declare atheism as their chosen belief system. Apparently, since he presents himself as a Muslim mutakallim, or perhaps a Muslim philosopher, who wishes to propose his own contribution to philosophical literature and to the academy on the subject matter, it only seemed fitting that he would do that. It has to be conceded that the reason why there are so many people who embrace atheism in the West is either because the arguments didn't convince them, or because the arguments themselves don't work like they should. After all, here I am, the mutakallim or the philosopher, publishing my own burhan in attempt to fix this problem. To fix it with a booklet no longer than 76 pages, mind you. But is it true that this really is the reason why so many atheists exhibit or exist in the English-speaking world today? So many atheists, 5% of the population? Of course not, brothers and sisters. The choice to become an atheist is to deny the clearest and most obvious dictates of fitrah, of innate reason and self-evident belief in a human being. Nobody, and I repeat, nobody needs to be given a theoretical reason to know that he was, in fact, made in this particular way rather than any other by a higher being who could have easily chosen not to make them at all, or to make them into something else altogether. A higher being that thereby deserves all gratitude, and by whose will the very purpose of one's short life in this world is to be determined. This is readily clear to everybody by nature, by the way that normal human minds work. Hijab admitted as much as we've shown in the previous lecture. Children do in fact exhibit this innate knowledge, and he admits that. Okay, so what is it that really happens to some mentally fit person who, by standard criteria of normalcy, exhibits fully functional mental and cognitive faculties to make them end up projecting this notion wholesale, the way atheists would insist on doing? Obviously, and since you've acknowledged the fitri knowledge as something we all have at birth, something that must have come, something must have happened at some point in their lives to disrupt their fitra, their better judgment. Okay, something must have buried that notion deep inside of them, something they picked up and learned from their parents and from the people they cherish in their immediate social circle. And indeed, that's what the Sunnah teaches us about how people become Christians, Jews, or whatever else. Okay, initially they are born on fitrah, okay, the knowledge that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala exists and that He deserves all praise and all worship, and then their parents make them embrace belief systems that contradict that. They are indoctrinated under different forms of social learning into beliefs that contradict that fitrah, that fitri knowledge. So what actually happens is a socio-psychological process that shifts the emotional inclinations of an individual to embrace what otherwise would be a clearly false and appalling belief to them. Okay, it is the actual reason why someone would insist on seeing falsity where there is innately clear truth, or seeing truth where there is innately clear falsity. Okay, similar processes would make a person convert to any false doctrine as an adult too. It takes a serious psychological malady to shift one from believing, for example, that the outside world around them is real, to believing that theirs is the only real mind that exists, or that they're actually nothing more than a brain in a vat. Okay, subjecting a person to sufficient social influence, like, for example, having him raised in a house where everybody believes that the outside world is nothing but a shared illusion, as a solipsist would insist, might in fact pressure them into rationalizing such a belief to themselves, treating it at least with less disdain and rebuke than others in fundamentally different social conditions would do. They would be tempted to think little of its innately obvious falsity and to even consider the ridiculous possibility that it might be true after all. Okay, it would not be the arguments that change their hearts, okay, but the emotional inclinations that affect how they're willing to think about any argument. Okay. Anybody who has ever attempted a debate with a Christian, for example, and tried to counter the belief in the Trinity, would tell you how ridiculous the arguments they provide for its rationality are, and yet they would spend hours upon hours defending those arguments. Okay, why? Is it because their falsity is not epistemically clear to them? Is it because there's a problem with epistemic clarity in the question? Because they need more theoretical reasons to see how astoundingly false the very notion of something being one thing and three distinct things at once really is? No, that's not it at all. The problem, brothers and sisters, is with the psychological inclinations in those people, the accumulated desires and fears in the hearts. It's what they love and what they hate that has the final verdict here, not what is rationally true. They deeply desire to stick to the doctrine of the Trinity, as false and ridiculous as they all know it to be, okay, innately, because they hate to even imagine the magnitude of the social change they would have to suffer once they decide to let go of it all. Okay, this becomes more the case when an individual is higher up in the ranks of the faith in his immediate society. You cannot expect a revered priest, for example, to let go of his faith following argument X, no matter how many lay people from the same faith found X to be compelling. Is it because, as a priest of the faith, he knows more than they did, and thereby he has theoretically sound reasons to reject X? No. It's actually because there's much more at stake for him if he chooses to accept X than there is for anybody else. The mastery of these people, the reverence, riyasa, okay, the social status he has worked for years and years to achieve. That's what's at stake here. That's what he hates so much to lose. All that would be gone in an instant once he decides to convert from the faith. Okay, he would turn at once from a beloved and revered father of the flocks of believers to an enemy of the community. The very thought of it is normally intolerable to most. This is why, by the way, many priests and monks who convert to Islam end up trying to work their way up in Islam as preachers and sheikhs, okay? And why many people who have been famous for many years for doing something haram in Islam, like being an actress, for example, or a dancer or something like that, would try to become da'iyah once they declare repentance and quit the job, okay? Because they have gotten so accustomed to fame and to the light that it brings, to the spotlight, that they hate leaving it. Okay, they hate to have to leave it behind, to quit it all. Okay, a hidden hawa khafi, is a malady that we should always be quite careful not to fall victim to. And Islam teaches us explicitly how to do that. The point here, brothers and sisters, is that shifting from a belief that one does have a maker to whom he owes everything, to a belief that no such maker exists at all, is even a griever form of psychological ailment than that which keeps a person attached to the doctrine of the Trinity. Okay, an ailment of heartly inclinations of hawa that needs to be identified as such, if we are really honest in seeking to save people from causes that lead to atheism. It is not and never was a problem of lack in rational premises or deficient theoretical knowledge about the existence of the Maker. In this introduction to his book, Hijab misses out entirely on the one reason why a sane, mentally fit individual would end up choosing voluntarily, knowingly, to declare that they do not know if they were created at all, or worse, that they know that they were not made at all, they were not created at all. And instead of identifying the actual problem, Hijab would rather reduce it to little more than an epistemic issue of the theoretical sufficiency of the arguments of Kalam. So he would feel justified in presenting his own argument as the one that does the job. Okay? How shameful indeed. We need to understand that it's not that an atheist does not know that he was indeed created with sheer wisdom and purpose, or that he knows he was not. It's rather that he has psychological reasons to accept fallacious and appallingly irrational belief systems in place of the innately obvious truth. Alright? This is why we insist that the prophetic argument al-Hujja al-Risaliyya holds upon every disbeliever who hears it, no matter what theoretical reasons they would claim to have for rejecting it. Okay? It's why our scholars drew a sharp distinction between hearing the argument ما سموه بسماع الحجة and finding it convincing فهم الحجة, and conceded that as long as an individual has heard it in his own language and has found no difficulty in understanding the words, understanding what it means, then he is to be treated as someone upon whom the hujjah has been established. أقيمت عليه الحجة. Ibn Taymiyyah rahimahullah can be cited in more places than one on this particular meaning, on this very meaning. Okay, it is of no consequence that a mushrik, for instance, insists that he doesn't find the prophetic argument from the Quran and from Sunnah and the rational refutation of his beliefs to be convincing or more rationally sound than whatever arguments he holds in his faith. He is to be treated as a rejecter of the truth nonetheless. Okay? Otherwise, one could easily enter an infinite regress of arguments and counter-arguments with someone who keeps insisting that he doesn't see any truth in what we claim to be necessarily obvious. This is why we insisted that the Kalami notion of absolute relativity of necessity is absolutely false, and it only functions as a vehicle to the defeat of the very concept of prophetic argument al-Hujja al-Risaliyya in Islam. Okay, no matter how many layers of false doctrine an individual builds for themselves in their cognitive structure, no matter how many fallacies or rationalizations they collect for themselves, they accumulate in their minds, working for years to convince themselves and others of their epistemic warrant, they will always have that innate knowledge buried deep inside, the knowledge that all this is false. The same knowledge they would admit in the afterlife in sheer regret that they have spent their entire lives denying and rejecting, okay, running away from, combating and refuting, as the Quran teaches us. If no such knowledge remained at the depth of the mushrik's mind, no matter what he or she did, then by no means would they deserve punishment in the afterlife just because they found the prophetic argument unconvincing. Okay, because that's what they would claim here in this world, but in the afterlife they wouldn't be able to make that claim. They would admit when it's too late, they would admit in the afterlife, when it's too late to regret, that they had heartly inclinations that kept them from admitting what they knew to be the truth deep inside. Okay, this holds true of every single mushrik who chooses, okay, which would, of course, with atheists included, or under the tag of mushriks, every single mushrik who chooses to reject the prophetic argument. All right, and it's obviously not a problem of knowledge, not the insufficiency of propositional arguments in theoretical terms. There is a point, a distinct point, where we always have to say, where we have to say, that's it, you're a liar. You know you're lying to yourself. You know your beliefs cannot be true. So quit trying to turn day into night and night into day. Alright? The problem with the Kalam method, brothers and sisters, is that it is founded on a method of theory, argument, and debate that makes reaching that point in principle unattainable. Alright? And it's only by hawa that they decide to end a debate and claim that the opponent has actually started to deny the obvious and all that stuff. Okay, جحد الضروريات and whatever they say there. The very claim that your opponent does not know or does not have a good reason to believe that they were indeed created and are being sustained is the biggest sophistry anybody could possibly commit. So to appeal to them with a propositional argument designed to establish theoretical knowledge of what it is that they claim not to know is to commit oneself to a sophist debate from the word go, in the very principle of it, and to testify to them that they do in fact have a good reason to dismiss the very notion of a creator. They might in fact be justified in so claiming. Okay, that's what the very concept of agreeing to debate them according to this method or in this manner actually implies. Okay, it's the message that it sends from the word go. They are, by virtue of the very method, to be treated as praiseworthy thinkers who have not yet come across a theory that convinces them that they were in fact created. Which is why Mutakallim is bound to fall victim to irja', as we elaborated in other lectures. Couple that with the Greek principle of metaphysical theory, where arguments are built to provide knowledge about all kinds of things that can or cannot in principle exist in reality, and how and why they get to acquire this or that attribute or fall under that meaning by virtue of their very existence, and you would immediately realize the magnitude of the crime that Kalam argumentation commits against both human reason and human faith alike. Okay, you would understand why it becomes utterly impossible to achieve knowledge of the existence of Allah, much less final faith in Islam, when one starts from arguments that take such theories for premises. Okay, it would be like trying to build a tower on haystack. The other unfortunate and inevitable downfall of Kalam and its reliance on metaphysical theory and metaphysical definitions is the fact that it invariably generates a belief in an abstract maker that cannot be given true personal attributes in any sensible, uncontradictory manner. This is so because a metaphysician specializes in putting forth a theoretical explanation of how general meanings pertaining to existing things come to be true of them, come to apply to them. Okay, something is to be described as being in time, for example, only when it is made up of so and so, as the theory hypothesizes or claims, or when it falls onto this the so-called fabric of reality or space-time. Okay, according to current metaphysics of relativity, or when it has the natures that the theory ascribes to all things that exist in the world. Something can only be described as moving or changing when it is composed of such and such, as the theorist would happily presume, as long as the function of the theory is to propose an explanation for coexistence, then no matter what it turns out to be like, then any argument to prove a maker that founds upon such theory will invariably yield an abstract maker devoid of all meaningful attributes, because it readily saves all attributable meanings to something that exists in reality for only such things that can be included in the categories described by the theory. Only such things that can be included in the categories described by the theory. If the question, what is motion, for example, is to become a subject matter for theory and explanation by analogy, then it follows that nothing in existence can be described as moving or exhibiting attributes of motion or falling under the meaning of motion in any sense that warrants the linguistic use of this word in describing it, whatever it is, without being a subject of the theory. Okay? It also follows inexorably that the maker of things that move cannot have the meaning of motion attributed to him in principle, because then his nature would have to be the same as described by the theory in explaining how things get to be described as moving or in motion. The same is true of time, of space, of change, and the likes. Okay? Once you comprehend this fundamental issue, you can see where all false doctrines and philosophies that philosophers have ever developed in their maker actually come from. The problem with Kalam, brothers and sisters, is that it embraces Greek metaphysical theory, the principle of it, okay, and attempts to show in sheer methodological contradiction that it can in fact yield belief in the precise creator that we Muslims believe in. Fact of the matter, as you shall see, is that what a mutakallim only manages to establish at the end of the day is the abstract maker of the philosophers, or in academic jargon, the theistic maker. Alright, the maker who is not a person and cannot be attributed to the exact meanings that we ascribe to him in Islam or in Christianity for that matter. Okay? In his book, Hijab seems to think that he is circumventing this fundamental issue with Kalam and its Greek presuppositions and methodological foundations, when instead of physical theory in its modern form, which includes the Kragan cosmological arguments, of course, he resorts to an argument from necessity and contingence, or something like it, okay? In other words, instead of following Al-Ghazali, he chooses to follow Ibn Sina to some extent, yani. We will show بحول الله وقوته, however, that he is delusional and that he fails to overcome the major issues with the very method of Kalam we outlined earlier, the foremost of which is the one we can see in the very passage we just quoted from his introduction. How would he overcome a problem he doesn't even recognize as a problem to begin with? People are atheists because they need better arguments. That's it. That's the issue. God forbid that the actual problem be that they have social and psychological commitments that cause them not to see the truth for what it is, that blind them from seeing the obvious truth. And are you implying that he should accuse major philosophers and pioneers of the academy he has tried for years to affiliate himself with of lying to themselves and exhibiting sheer ignorance, sheer arrogance in dealing with this major question? Of course he wouldn't. Are you kidding? Where else would he get his PhD then? He proceeds to write, considering this, it may come as a surprise that Richard Dawkins probably the West's most popular academic atheist, dedicates only 2 pages to refuting the design argument for God's existence and 5 to Aquinas' cosmological argument in the God delusion. The fact that new atheists seem to have not engaged with the analytic evidence of theists, combined with the fact that analytic philosophy dominates most Western university settings, gives theists a wide theoretical opening. They can reintroduce some of the most enduring natural theological arguments posited throughout history. Okay. Oh no, no surprise at all. No surprise here. The reason I say this is because neither Dawkins nor any other atheist have in fact decided to embrace atheism due to what they think about the arguments of theists. Okay? No propositional argument to prove the existence of a maker as such, no matter how powerful you may think it to be, would change the minds of people who have already sympathized or identified with that movement. People, brothers and sisters, only change their minds on such an issue following a fundamental change in their heartly inclinations, أهواء قلوبهم, not following the evidence for theism. I wouldn't one day decide to believe, for example, that I only came into being 5 minutes ago and that all the memories I hold of past events are false, okay, following some argument or due to some fault I found in arguments designed to convince me otherwise. I'm programmed by design to believe that past memories are true. They did in fact happen the way I remember them. Okay? I never resorted to some argument to learn that fact. And so I wouldn't end up embracing that belief due to a shift in my epistemic judgment with respect to such arguments. The idea that such a shift in belief would be due to argumentative or epistemic failure is fundamentally wrong and categorically misleading. The same, I contend, is true of the belief that I do have a creator sustainer to whom I owe my very existence. Why should these two issues be treated differently in terms of epistemic quadrant if it wasn't for a long heritage of Greek sophistry on the latter issue in particular, a legacy that atheists no longer even bother to get into? And though many of them would tell you that they have in fact considered many of these classic arguments in their self-proclaimed search for the truth, and obviously ruled them out as lacking and unconvincing, the fact remains that whatever proposition you make to convince them that they had a maker will never do the job. And because you overlook the real reason why they ended up declaring atheism, you risk having their sick inclinations lead them to beliefs about their maker that contradict what we Muslims are supposed to be calling for, if indeed they decided to choose to accept any argument that you present to them, okay? Which is actually what happens pretty much all the time that one of them decides to convert to Islam following this or that argument. Every time an atheist decides to shift to other milder, tamer forms of atheism like agnosticism or deism or irreligion or the likes, he is not actually following evidence as a mutakallim would find himself compelled to praise him for. He is only reacquiring a more comfortable social position for himself. Okay? This is precisely the sociological reason why so many such shades of grey exist in labels and detailed attitudes of atheism. Okay, strong atheism is too much for you guys? Well, fine. Let's fashion up a friendly atheism stance and declare it instead. You still hate us too much for our liking, for our social comfort? Well, fine. How about an agnostic position then? How about we claim we don't actually know that you are all delusional in your faith? We only fail to see enough evidence to convince us with it. Okay, how about that? Sounds better, sounds more comfortable, more socially appealing position. Okay, and if we decide to become agnostics, we decide to call ourselves agnostics, we decide to claim that we don't know. Okay, how about we claim that we don't know and neither do you? Okay, that's a strong agnosticism position, a strong agnostic position. Nobody can know, in fact, that the answer to this question is this or that. Okay, if you guys would accept us for this position, then fine. That's what we are. We're strong agnostics. Okay, that's too much. That's too troubling. We're gonna have to take a lot of heat for that all the time. Then okay, how about we decide we don't know if this is the case. Okay, we don't know about you guys if you know or if you don't. We're trying to figure out what you guys have. Okay, and if it does in fact convince us that you would really know anything at all. But let's call ourselves weak agnostics. Let's say that it's just we. The problem is that we don't know anything. Okay, we're not claiming that you don't know either. Okay, we're not gonna go that far. Let's just say that we just don't know. It's just us. How about that? Sounds better? Okay, in an all-including culture nurtured by the long-standing Greek ethos of debate and dispute, people are bound to sympathize with such shifts, as many as they are. Okay, as varied as they are. There's a wide range, wide spectrum. Okay, of degrees that atheists have invented for themselves in this debate, and even identify them as testaments to this sincerity of those who commit them. Okay, you are a seeker of the truth, no matter what belief you insist on embracing, or not embracing for that matter, as long as you exhibit cordial respect and willingness to engage with the evidence of theists one way or another, as long as you accept the debate. Okay, you accept to get into debates and to respect the people who debate you. Live as a disbeliever for as long as you will. That's okay, as long as you do take part on occasion in the perpetual circus of a debate that philosophers would have you follow. You're all right. We got no problem with that. We're not allowed to have a problem with that. Okay, in this cultural context, in this cultural spirit, in this zeitgeist of things. Okay, you should be excused for failing to come out with anything meaningful when all is said and done. Okay, every time you attend a debate or discussion like that, you come out thinking that okay, it keeps getting more complicated. It keeps getting more unclear to me, and so I'm still undecided. I will spend the rest of my life undecided. You're fine. You're okay. We will have to praise you for that because you're seeking the truth. It's an extremely complicated question, so you're fine. You're okay. We respect you. Okay, we appreciate you. We appreciate what you're trying to do. Okay, some mutakallimin did in fact argue for an excuse in the afterlife for such a case, as I've explained elsewhere. All right. After all, the question is already classified in the academy as the most difficult question any thinker will have to wrestle with. There is no settling it in academic terms, and you know beforehand that whatever position, and I mean whatever position, you wish to take, you will easily find champions for it in the cesspool of literature that academic philosophers have accumulated throughout the centuries. Okay? The very same cesspool that Hijab here is so eager to jump into and would happily have you drown into with him. So one really can't help asking Hijab at this point, how many pages should Dawkins have dedicated for the theist's arguments in his book, for him to qualify as intellectually justifiable in his position? How many pages? Would you have excused him for his position had he decided to dedicate an entire volume for the long-standing academic debate on those arguments? Okay, what is it? Not enough? Would 3 volumes perhaps have made you feel better about them? Have made you feel better about him? The problem, brothers and sisters, is that Hijab, as the academic philosopher he is now proclaiming himself to be, is trying to show you that it is only because Dawkins has overlooked the literature that he ended up championing that position. Okay, only because he overlooked the literature altogether. Okay, sadly, he's not a philosopher, Dawkins. Had he been a trained philosopher in the analytic tradition of the academy, things would have been quite different. He would at least have exhibited some sympathy and respect to the theists and their arguments. He would have played by the rules. It wouldn't matter. He would have selected a tamer position, like a friendly atheist position, for example. We would have liked him much better then, you know. It wouldn't matter what he and his followers would end up believing if he did. What matters is to not propagate a hardline stance that dismisses theists from the academy and pushes them off the table of philosophy altogether. Okay, that's it. That's the battle. That's what the entire battle is all about, guys. A mutakallim never actually cares what exact beliefs his opponent ends up believing, or the followers of his opponent would end up believing, as long as he manages to defeat them publicly. Okay, to show his own prowess and skill as a philosopher and a debater. That's what this is all about. The underlying sentiment is that if he wins, then the religion he proclaims to be fighting for will, by default, be the winner too. Right? The mutakallim. Nothing, however, could be farther from the truth. I cannot begin to count the number of detailed beliefs in the attributes of the Lord that Christians are traditionally taught to believe in their churches that William Lane Craig destroys in pretty much every debate. When asked about this, he would easily counter by saying, well, who said that those beliefs are actually binding to the church? Look at the literature from Aquinas, from Augustine, from Anselm, or other towering figures of the church, and you will see that we have much free space to fall into with our beliefs. He literally said that more than once. Okay, we're allowed in the eyes of the church to believe the book of Genesis, for example, to have literally happened, or to only take it for metaphor. Okay, if you go that way or this way or that way, you're okay in the church. Because we're okay if we think that the Lord didn't actually create species fully adapted from the start, okay, but rather let billions of faulty specimens crash and burn until fitting mutations came to emerge when they did. Okay, we're okay if we believe him to have no active role in the world, whatever, apart from intervening every now and then for different reasons to create miracles and stuff like that. We're okay if we actually end up believing in Newton's God or even Einstein's God, but only as long as we add the little twist that he has had Jesus as his son from eternity and sacrificed him on the cross for the sins of man. The point is, brothers and sisters, a theist philosopher actually doesn't bother with what attributes you will end up ascribing to your maker, just as long as you end up admitting that there is indeed a maker, and following, of course, his argumentation and the proposition he makes. Had Dawkins shown some willingness to engage with the theist philosophers, then they wouldn't have hated him that much. As long as he identifies us as peers, we wouldn't be bothered with what beliefs he chooses to propagate. He, however, chose to look down on theistic philosophers and to dismiss them wholesale. Okay, and nothing angers a philosopher, nothing upsets them more than anyone looking down on them, or not giving them the due respect they believe they've earned. I'm not claiming that this is the intention that drove Hijab in particular to write this about Dawkins' book here. I'm only saying that this is the general spirit amongst theistic philosophers. It's the reason someone like Alvin Plantinga, for example, famously criticized Dawkins' book with pretty much the same criticism. Dawkins' book was argumentatively as poor and naive as the work of a sophomore student in philosophy. He said something to that effect, which automatically would have you wonder, would you have thought any better of him had he built his exact same case on the shoulders of pioneering atheistic philosophers of past and present, quoting much of what they had to say for that end? The answer would sadly be yes. They wouldn't have had grounds to discredit him in any way, shape, or form if he had done that. They wouldn't even be justified intellectually in accusing him of lying to himself and insisting on resoundingly false position, and insisting on propagating a resoundingly false position. He would then be yet another peer to whom they are obliged to show cordial respect and appreciation, and engage in debates with him, if friendly debates, even if the occasion arises. Hijab goes on to say, many of the arguments I will present in this book I have used in applied settings for over a decade. In this time, I have had deep and meaningful conversations with hundreds of atheists and agnostics, particularly in the UK. I aim to give the reader a flavor of the interactions I have had with people from different cross-sections of society, and to that I ask, why exactly would you need to do that? Either the argument works on merit of its rational consistency and objective power, according to the tradition of analytic philosophy, that is, or it doesn't. What difference would it make then to test it in applied settings, as he calls them? He would say, or create case studies and stuff like that. Why? He would say that depending on the person's background, upbringing, personal preferences, beliefs, values, and inclinations, the proper argument to address them with should be determined. The proper argument to address them with should be determined, according, of course, to the givens of that sort, of that type. Okay. But that would be nothing but smoke and mirrors, brothers and sisters, because as we stated earlier, it's not lack of evidence that prompted these people to embrace atheism. It's actually a major shift in social preferences, in likes and dislikes. So there is no predicting on purely epistemic grounds pertaining to the types and structures of propositional kalami arguments which type of person would prefer which type of argument, no matter what experience a mutakallim would ascribe to themselves. There is no logical grounds for correlation in this, folks, because it's not the rational makeup of the argument that appeals to a person when it does. It would be like saying, every time I wear this pair of shoes, I hit a traffic jam on the street, so the next time I ride my car on this street, I should pick a different pair of shoes. The correlation as such is nothing more than trivial circumstantial covariance. They just happen to vary together. Okay? simultaneously. The point is, it doesn't matter how many people did accept atheism, and not Islam, by the way, since no kalam propositional argument building on first principles as such would be an argument for the particular creator who Muslims worship. It doesn't matter how many people did accept theism because of a particular argument you use. It just happened that they felt different inclinations talking to you when they did, where they did, so they liked what you gave them and they followed it. Okay. This does not mean, however, that one should not pay heed to the way the subjects of da'wah feel or to the social or individual differences they exhibit when we address them. No, that's not what I'm saying. Of course we should. As we pointed out earlier, and as is to be understood from Ibn Taymiyyah's famously misinterpreted quotation we discussed in earlier lectures, we should always make sure to pick the most suitable arguments in refuting the false doctrines that people embrace, depending on their mentality and the depth of their involvement with the doctrine itself, in terms of philosophy or scholarship or readership. Okay, as long as you have reason to believe that they might listen to you and accept what you have to say, then you should proceed to address them in the most fitting arguments and types of premises to the way that they think. Okay, because you're trying to refute stuff that they have built upon a certain type of arguments. Okay, but that's only true when the argument you're offering is a rational refutation of their false doctrines, not a propositional attempt to establish the existence of the Creator Himself upon premises that they like, premises that they favor. The difference here, brothers and sisters, is crucial and fundamental. It's a methodological difference between the method of prophets and their followers on one hand, and the method of philosophers and their followers on the other. Okay, we, Ahl Sunnah wal Athar, followers of the Prophet, believe that the knowledge of the existence of a Creator who is worthy of absolute veneration and submission does exist innately in every human being at birth, and that whoever claims otherwise is a sophist, okay, and is lying to themselves. So when we sense that some atheist is to some extent inclined to listen to us and perhaps accept from us, we don't proceed to construct that knowledge itself for him propositionally by theoretical means. Rather, we attempt to bust away all the fallacies, falsities, and inclinations associated with them in our subject, showing them how utterly ridiculous they all are by powerful entailment, seeking the most striking and effective arguments in this respect, depending, of course, on what background they may have. We believe that once the entire cognitive structure of falsity is busted and the background and the inclinations for accepting them are exposed to the subject, then they would be left with no excuse to deny what their fitrah still tells them. If you look closely, you will find that that's exactly what the Quran does. Even in those instances where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala presents what would seem to be positive argument, like the famous verse, أَمْ خُلِقُوا مِنْ غَيْرِ شَيْءٍ أَمْ هُمُ الْخَالِقُونَ, or were they created by nothing, or did they create themselves, it's actually a refutational argument in the context of showing how scandalously ridiculous the entailments of their beliefs really are. Alright? It's like saying, oh, you seriously don't accept the notion of a creator? So what? You think your creator, you think you created yourselves? Or that you were created by nothing at all? Obviously, those are the only other options here. See how ridiculous your position really is? Okay, is that what you're trying to convince yourself with? That's what the argument is about here, brothers and sisters. It's not in any sense a propositional argument. You would have to neglect the entire context of the verse and the manner in which it is spoken to get away with such a characterization of this argument as mutakallimin would commonly do, as Hijab himself does most of the time. Obviously enough, this is neither the tone nor the manner in which a mutakallim or an apologist presents their arguments when they do. Allah is clearly not proposing the knowledge of creation on theoretical grounds here. He is rather shocking the disbelievers by hitting home the ridiculous entailments of the position. It's obviously a call for them to wake up and quit fooling themselves, not to engage in a prolonged theoretical debate upon a proposition that may or may not convince them. So that's what we do. We refute, we debunk, we show the shockingly false entailments of false beliefs, and we attempt, when needed, psychological treatments of bishara and nidara, because without sufficient incentive to shift the inclinations of the heart, there can probably be no hope in shifting a mushrik to the right path. After all, we're necessarily asking him to break from the comfort zone of his immediate social setting, turning friends and loved ones to foes and opponents mostly, Okay, and usually overnight. So unless that very unpleasant outcome is outweighed by the reward of the afterlife and the inner balance of love and hate that a person processes in their subconscious mind, there would be no reason for our subject to tolerate the fallout from the social bomb he is required to trigger. Okay, by declaring that he has converted or changed his religion. Now an apologist or a mutakallim or a theistic philosopher, on the other hand, is bound by the Greek rules of engagement with philosophers to only present his belief in a maker as a theoretical proposition, a meek suggestion that builds upon metaphysical notions that happen to enjoy academic acceptance in his time. It has to, of course, go in line with those metaphysical beliefs, or the so-called first principles, okay? It can only be presented as a suggestion here. He suggests that he has some premises that would, when combined, entail the existence of an abstract maker. Okay, that's the theory he proposes. And only depending on the entailments of the metaphysical premises of that argument should the belief in what meanings can or cannot be ascribed to that creator be determined. The theistic maker is thus invariably little more than the abstract maker of the philosophers that could only have such attributes that would be allowed by the metaphysical theory upon which his entire existence is established, argumentatively and propositionally, which practically reduces him to nothing more than an imaginary being to which contradictory meanings are ascribed. Okay, obviously there is no talk in such discourse of consequences in the afterlife for this or that belief. No talk of punishment in the afterlife to those who insist upon this belief. Not even a hint is allowed to the actual ailment, psychological ailment, that keeps one from accepting the clear truth in مسألة الهوى. Because the initial assumption upon which the entire Kalam debate is built is that we are two philosophers standing on equal footing, with each of us harboring honest intentions, okay, and suffering equal chance of their belief turning out to be theoretically false. Okay, you see how fundamentally different those two approaches to argument and argumentation on this particular subject really are. Okay. Now, Mutakallim might counter at this point that the method he uses does not include metaphysical notions or theories, none that might at least entail a damaged set of beliefs about the Lord's attributes. So not all Kalami methods are created equal, he would argue. I suspect that that's how Hijab would apologize for his apologetic methods. However, part of the reason why the Salaf condemned the method of Kalam, brothers and sisters, is because it presupposes that some people don't know that they were indeed created. No prophet ever came with philosophical arguments, ontological or cosmological or whatever, devised to convince his people that they actually have a maker to whom they owe everything. Okay, that possibility, that's the possibility that someone might in fact not know, okay, that they were created, was not even on the table. It was not even an option. It's not even there. Okay, in the practice of prophethood. So to claim that some people would be justified in rejecting the Prophet's teachings on the grounds that they needed to have such arguments presented to them first, in advance, in a manner that might convince them that there really is someone up there who sends prophets to people at all, is to claim that the Prophet didn't do the job properly. The prophets didn't do the job properly. Okay, there would be an ample reason then to reject the verse in the Quran that says رُسُلًا مُبَشِّرِينَ وَمُنذِرِينَ لِأَلَّا يَكُونَ لِلنَّاسِ عَلَى اللَّهِ حُجَّةٌ بَعْدَ الرُّسُلِ وَكَانَ اللَّهُ عَزِيزًا حَكِيمًا. Translation of the meaning: messengers of good tiding and of warning, in order that mankind might have no argument against Allah after the messengers. Allah was ever mighty, ever wise. Alright, because obviously some would then have argument against Allah. Okay, if this were the case, then someone would have argument against Allah if it stands to be the case that they were never given any sufficient arguments for the belief that they were indeed created. If I never even knew I was created and did in fact need arguments that I was never given for the validity of that claim, working arguments, sound arguments that were invulnerable, irrefutable, indefeatable, then I had no reason to accept the messenger's claim to prophethood, and so it would be unfair to punish me for not accepting his message. But the messengers actually built their teachings upon the presupposed innate knowledge that the Creator does in fact exist, with no heed to the philosophers' take on the issue at all. Besides, we shall show that there is no detaching oneself from metaphysical commitments in any of the arguments that he puts forth, since the premise to a philosophical argument for the existence of the Maker will always have to involve some metaphysical notions, either about this world in particular or about abstract meanings that are believed to be true of any possible world. Meanings that will by necessity be less clear than the very notion they're supposed to help establish, as Ibn Taymiyyah rahimahullah famously criticized the Kalam method in more places than one. Now, Hijab proceeds to say, much is at stake in the representation of these arguments of God for God's existence. For many, the intellectual validity of theism is predicated on the soundness of these arguments and the degree to which they can be clearly articulated. For theists to be truly effective, they must be able to justify the beliefs from first principles. And this is precisely what's wrong with the Kalam methods, brothers and sisters, with the Kalam method, the Kalam, Ilm al-Kalam. If indeed it is the case that for many the validity of belief in a maker is predicated on the success of such arguments, then those many are suffering from an obvious cognitive defect that needs to be addressed if indeed we wish for them to leave this world standing on unshakable grounds in terms of belief in the truth. If this was even possible for people with hearts as such as their own. What Kalam does, however, is nurture that defect, establishing the entire belief system of so inclined people onto it. The way of Kalam is simply to try to entertain your subject with whatever type of theoretical argument they insist is the only way for them to know that they were indeed created at all. Regardless of the negative effects on the beliefs of the subject, such an argument would yield on the long run due to the nature of the premises that it involves. You like the theory of substances and essence, Nadariyat al-Jawhar al-Arad? Fine. Let me then concoct a cosmological argument to prove the existence of a maker from the first principles and metaphysical notions the theory comes with. That's okay, and that's what Mutakallimun of old have been doing all the time, most of the time. You prefer modern physics instead? Okay, fine. Then let me then entertain you with an argument from the law of entropy, okay, or from the Big Bang theory. Okay, or from fine-tuning with its metaphysical notions and presumption and presuppositions, whatever they may turn out to be as grounds for that argument. You like mathematics? Then okay, how about a mathematical argument for the existence of God? That, brothers and sisters, is by no means the way of a da'iyah, a follower of the Prophet ﷺ. It's the way of an entertainer or a conjurer of cheap tricks who uses his sleight of hand to entertain people by demonstrating his skill to them. Okay, pick a card, any card, and I will tell you what it was all the same. It's almost like that. It matters not what the theory may entail in terms of the attributes of the maker you establish upon it. What matters is that we manage to pick the right card every time, impressing the audience just the same. Okay, you want a maker that suits prevailing metaphysics, whatever it happens to be at the time, or goes well with the color of your particular philosophical shirt. You'll get your maker. I can make him for you. I can deduce him to you. That's Kalam for you, brothers and sisters. That's Kalam. That's what Kalam is all about. He says, for theists to be truly effective, okay, listen to this word, effective, they must be able to justify the beliefs from first principles. And at this point we must ask, who or what is a theist anyway? What particular set of beliefs would qualify one as a theist if he embraces them? Just the belief that we humans have been created by some maker, any maker? Then all humans from all different religious doctrines and denominations who are not atheists are by definition theists, right? And then you're not only selling us soap bubbles when you claim that theists would be justifying their beliefs using such arguments you propose. They would not. In reality, all that theism amounts to is the abstract maker with no attributes at all, as we pointed out earlier. Those are the beliefs that the theist would be establishing. Notice how full of himself he sounds when he speaks of first principles, as though all philosophers would readily and happily agree with him on what those principles are or ought to be. There is no such thing as a first principle in philosophy, brother. Any notion you arbitrarily choose to call first principle could be refuted or at least challenged by an opponent who chooses other first principles in their stead. Okay, this is the nature of the discipline you are dragging your followers by their feet to jump into and to engage with under the tag of being an effective theist. They are required to turn the belief in their creator into some derivative theoretical suggestion that should be milked from the teat of some philosophers' theoretical notion of first principle. Okay, that's the only way it would merit the status of rationality in the eyes of the academy, and so it must be done. Okay, it's not about saving people, then, brothers and sisters, the method of kalam or the kalam method. It never was. It's rather a method of argumentation designed specifically to secure the apologist a share amongst the great philosophers of his time. Whatever the prevailing metaphysical system happens to be, change that metaphysics and they'll follow with novel arguments, no problem. Okay, that's exactly what Hijab here is trying to be. It is trying to do. He's trying to find himself a chair among the revered philosophers and mutakallim of the time. Okay, he's trying to revive an old argument in ancient books, an argument by Ibn Sina, because he thinks that, well, okay, if people are not using it, my peer philosophers and mutakallimin of the West are not actually using it, when in fact if they do use it, it might give them some place to fit into in the academic structure of Western philosophy, in the academic institution. That's what he's trying to do. He's trying to make a name for himself in the field, to put it bluntly. All right. He says, in this book, I aim to specifically analyze Ibn Sina's Burhan argument for the existence of God, as I regard it as most invulnerable to any type of counterattacks. The Burhan argument postulates that a world with only contingent existences is inconceivable, as a contingent existence cannot cause itself. Okay. Now, there are two methodological issues here. First of all, he admits implicitly that other arguments are, to some extent, vulnerable to some types of counterattacks, which is generally something he cannot deny. And the question that arises here is this: how would you allow for less invulnerable arguments to be used in establishing the necessary knowledge for faith in the hearts and minds of people you call to Islam, a religion that takes nothing less than final certainty, as opposed to theoretical conditional certainty, as we explained in earlier lectures, in its validity as a condition for salvation in the afterlife? What kind of certainty is a person who accepts a kalami argument required to establish in the validity of his faith anyway? What kind of certainty? Obviously, not a final certainty. Since as long as there are philosophers and there is an academic an academy for philosophers, academic philosophy, there will always be the possibility of someone coming up with counterattacks that should at least render the argument less compelling to those who embrace it. Even this one you have chosen, as we shall see, if not defeated altogether. This is yet another major issue with Kalam and its method, and with the entire discipline of philosophy of religion that has earned the practice of Kalam the disdain of the Salaf, regardless of the argument of choice for the mutakallim or the particular beliefs that he branches by entailment from that argument. We Muslims are required to harbor the serious intention of never letting go of what we believe to be a tenet of our religion. We exit the circle of Islam altogether once we start exhibiting doubt or uncertainty in any of the major tenets of the deen. So if the base foundation of these tenets, the belief in a creator, was indeed a question of theoretical arguments that could, if at least in principle, be blown away by the opponent in any given debate, or could be vulnerable to some type of counterattack, as happens all the time in academic philosophy, of course, how can a final certainty, the unwavering determination to never let go of the faith for as long as one lives, be taken for a condition for salvation in the afterlife in Islam? If indeed certainty in the existence of God, at least to some people, is only reasonably possible to as far as the argument and its the defenses would allow, then how come they are taken to deserve eternal punishment in hellfire in Islam if they die on doubt or disbelief? What major offense would earn me such a horrible fate after death if all I ever did was follow a reasonable, legitimate discussion on the epistemic warrant provided by such arguments that are supposed to establish the knowledge of the very existence of my Maker in my mind? What if that's actually as far as my mental faculties can afford? What if I really cannot see how any of these arguments could overcome the counterattacks of the opponents? If in principle the belief in the existence of our Maker is indeed only a metaphysical theory of some sort that relies upon some first principles or premises that happen to be the subject of debate and dispute among the greatest and most brilliant minds on earth, the philosophers, then why is it such a major offense for me to end up deciding that I'm not convinced? Okay. and to die on such a conviction or to die in such a position. This is why no mutakallim can ever really answer the famous philosophical objection to the very idea of an eternal punishment in hellfire for choosing not to accept the message of Islam. In principle, and according to the Greek theory of knowledge that every mutakallim is bound to by virtue of the very practice of kalam and where it actually stemmed from and where it actually emerges from, it shouldn't even be a punishable offense at all to begin with, to die on such a position, or an agnosticism, or disbelief. Why should he be offended? Why should Allah be offended at all, if indeed this is the level of the evidence that He has given us, and the type of discussion we would have to go through in order to scrutinize its validity, as any reasonable person is required to do with any theoretical claim? Why would he take offense if indeed someone like Bertrand Russell did meet him in the afterlife with his famous arrogant remark, "Sorry sir, not enough evidence"? Okay. At least to Russell, the evidence was not enough, or so he claims. And by the same token, it is not enough to many others as well. And so a mutakallim is compelled to wonder, what was the job of a prophet anyway? And how come they did not teach or practice analytic philosophy, letting their followers embrace the religion upon the feeblest of arguments, if at all? At this point, the mutakallim would counter saying, "Oh no, of course they had good arguments, but good arguments are not necessarily philosophical arguments." And to that we would respond by saying, "But if they did not perform epistemically sufficient nadar before they decided to embrace Islam, then you are bound to render their knowledge and their faith lacking at best, feeble." By epistemically sufficient, I mean the kind of theoretical investigation that defeats all possible objections to the argument of choice and silences all possible objections and counterattacks to it, just like Hijab here is venturing to do. Okay? The argument has to be such that it is invulnerable to any type of counterattack, because otherwise it would be a faulty, irrational basis for belief, right? That's why you're doing what you're doing, or so you claim, Hijab, right? And then what would become of the faith of those poor fellows who happen to be of lesser philosophical prowess and ability to even notice the pitfalls and failures of the argument they appealed to? That would be someone who hinges his entire belief system on a proposition that is not rationally sound. Is that okay with the mutakallim? This is why only those mutakallimun who were true to the entailments of their method held that one is not to be considered a Muslim at all if they fail to build their faith upon a sound, well-defended, invulnerable argument for the existence of God, اللي هو النظر يعني. Which of course implies that every mukallaf should, by religious duty, learn enough kalam to become a proficient mutakallim who is always ready to defend his argument against the infinite, perpetual barrage of philosophical objections that emerge every day in the academy against every one of those arguments, because otherwise he himself would not be rationally justified in building his entire belief system upon this or that argument. Which is obviously, and again, something that no prophet of Allah has ever taught or called for. So you see, brothers and sisters, the very idea of practicing kalam in the sense we've outlined here and in previous lectures is detrimental to the very concept of final faith in Islam. You engage with philosophers on the implicit notion that your theoretical justifications might in fact turn out to be all bunkers. You have that implicit notion, at least within the realm of rational possibility, otherwise there is no sense in having such a debate at all. So how can that even begin to qualify as a justifiable faith in the afterlife? It defeats the very concept of faith, as I've explained here and elsewhere. This is why many of the Salaf rejected that type of debates, the debates of kalam, on the grounds that it's the practice of someone who is willing to let go of his deen altogether under the influence of some propositional argument from this or that opponent in any given debate. We Muslims are by no means willing to do that, or to even come near a place where such could be the fate of our beliefs. The practice of kalam is condemned in Islam not because of particular arguments or theories that came out of it historically, as every mutakallim would try to convince you. It's condemned because by virtue of the very notion of building positive philosophical arguments for the existence of God, by virtue of the Greek theory of knowledge where the existence of God is little more than a theoretical suggestion, it destroys the finality of faith in Islam. Okay, renders final certainty categorically unattainable, reducing it to little more than conditional theoretical certainty. You're certain only insofar as you still haven't stumbled upon evidence or theoretical arguments that convince you otherwise. يعني على شرط ظهور عدم المعارض، على ده اللي بنسميه في المصطلح على شرط عدم المعارض. Theoretical certainty is not the kind of faith we are required to exhibit in the major tenets of the deen, أصول الدين, brothers and sisters. The belief that we were indeed created and are being sustained by an almighty being of absolute perfect attributes is not a theory that one needs to do work to acquire. It's as true to us as the fact that we do exist in the real world at all, or that what we believe has happened to us in the past did indeed happen. And the fact that some people have been nourished with false doctrines that deny this innately clear notion does not put us in the position of having to establish that notion itself by theoretical means. Let them whine and claim all they want that they don't know or have any good reason to know it to be true. We will address them, if at all, only in the way that the prophets and their immediate disciples would address them, not in the way they would prefer or they would insist that the debate should be like. This sophist and utterly corrupt epistemic demand was supposed to be rejected and ridiculed the very first time some philosopher dared to make it among Muslims. The very first time a philosopher dared to claim that he cannot see a reason to believe that he was created at all. Right. Sadly, however, it was not treated by some in the proper way. Some did not treat it in the proper way, that claim, once they came across it. Some people found it as a challenge for their minds to not be able to conjure up some deductive arguments for the belief the way philosophers would do with any and all beliefs was unthinkable to them. It was unthinkable to them that they would not do that, because it would render them irrational according to the ways of the philosophers. So they fell under the spell of the academic worth of the philosophers and decided that we do in fact need to come up with propositional arguments to prove the existence of the unseen entity that we worship, we Muslims. Okay, one particular individual, Al-Jahm ibn Safwan, even decided to quit doing salat altogether for 40 days until his friend Wasir ibn Ata suggested to him an argument to him to present to the philosophers who challenged him. Okay, and so was born the practice of kalam among Muslims. The second methodological issue with this statement by Hijab, brothers and sisters, is that he actually thinks that this argument by Ibn Sina is invulnerable to any type of counterattacks. Now, any philosopher who makes that bold claim about a propositional argument he came up with, whatever that argument may be, is by all means delusional. Okay, and it's really pathetic that they would. Why? Because by virtue of the very nature of the field of the discipline itself, the field of philosophy, any refutation, no matter how sophist you may view it to be, no matter how sophist, no matter how silly you may view it to be, is a legitimate counterattack that you are required to respond to as long as it plays by the general rules of engagement in the academy. Okay? Now, you may counter that by maintaining that there are indeed some instances in the history of philosophy where philosophers did end up agreeing to a certain claim and finding it ridiculous to attack it in principle. However, you would be a fool to think that this is due to the epistemic warrant of that claim or the success of the argument and the power of logic that particular philosopher, that this or that philosopher managed to provide. Whatever that may be. It is never anything more than an intersubjective shift in the preferences of the academic community that would cause such an agreement. Today, almost all philosophers agree that Darwinian evolution, for example, is an established fact. So is this general attitude of the academy due to its really being an established fact in itself? Absolutely not. Almost all of them agree now that homosexuality is not an abnormal human condition. Is this agreement due to new compelling evidence or any form of epistemic warrant at all? No. It's only a shift in intersubjective preferences of theory that made them just happen to decide collectively to consider certain vacuous claims as evidence and warrant. Okay, suddenly we feel bad about those poor queer people, and we sympathize we sympathize with their desire to enjoy their sexual preferences freely like the rest of us, and so we decide to give them intellectual room to breathe in this respect. Okay, and gradually the phenomenon is no longer defined as a psychological and sociological abnormality. The academy just doesn't like that anymore. Okay. So, what normally happens, brothers and sisters, is that philosophers follow trends, and trends rise and fall due to purely sociological factors. One day it's trendy to embrace this definition of X, the next day it's not. Another definition comes along and many people seem to like it, so the trend changes, and the bandwagon just shifts its path and on it goes. Okay, in a discipline where the very notion of rational necessity is relative and the very foundations of rationality are up for dispute. Okay, to the extent that someone would actually write a book that they would title "A Critique of Pure Reason." Okay, in a discipline where the very notion of rational necessity is relative, and such is the case, such is the general spirit of thinking and of reasoning. Okay, what else would you expect? What else would you expect? Okay, so one can't help laughing at the confidence with which this man presents his argument, rendering it invulnerable to any type of counterattack. How cute indeed. If indeed there is one super irrefutable argument in the subject matter, then why did the philosophers not use it to settle the debate centuries ago and save us all the trouble? The answer is obviously, folks. The answer is obvious, folks. There is no such thing in philosophy and subsequently in Kalam as a final argument or the argument of oral arguments or something that kills the dispute objectively. Okay, so to dream of an argument that would simply kill the academic debate on objective grounds is nothing but wishful thinking. One has to wonder at this point, why would he bother at all with how people feel or what they prefer when it comes to the types of arguments and propositions that may or may not convince them or appeal to them, as he seems to take heed of in this introduction, if indeed he thinks that this one particular argument he has finally chosen is the one that is objectively sufficient and superiorly invulnerable to counterattacks. Obviously, he should make it his job to have everybody, regardless of their social background, build their faith upon that one super irrefutable argument, and to show that no objections to it would amount for anything at all. Or would he be okay with letting some people embrace an argument that is lesser to that, an argument that he knows is philosophically flawed or unsound, or at least not as irrefutable as this one? Fact of the matter is that by virtue of the Greek origins of this method, rational necessity is absolutely relative, and the practice thus only works by seeking common grounds, whatever they may be, with the one you're debating in order to achieve anything with them. This fundamental illusion of objectivity in the practice of kalam is one of the reasons why the Salaf condemned it. Wallahu musta'an.